but it's a bit more complicated. So let me just draw a box here. So if I wanted to change anything about this this cube here, anything that I would do is unless I make, copy, 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 which is good, modeling practice. Anything that I do is going to be destructive, right? I could undo, but that doesn't, it's a different workflow, right? So if I wanted to, make it smaller, I would make it smaller. If I wanted to stretch it, right, I would do that. If I wanted to make copies of it, right? It's all through, the basic Rhino commands. But if I if I want to define a cube in Rhino, there's a lot of different ways of thinking about it. Right? So the parts of a cube would be the corner points, right? There's 8 of those. The edges, there's 12 of those. There's the faces, there's 6 of those. And then there's the cube itself, right? And the best way to parametrically model anything is to reduce everything down to its constituent components, okay? So let's say the simplest way to define a cube would be if I double click right here, what they call it the canvas. If I double click, that brings up a search box, okay? And any Rhino command that you can think of also works in here, right? We have line, we have copy, we have box, we have polyline, polygon, we have Boolean. So all of the commands are the same with some additional steps. But let's say we do box. Okay. You see all these little icons next to each word, right? The shape and color and image of each icon will tell you what kind of component you're going to get. Each piece of the Grasshopper script is called a component. So let's say I click on this first one with the black hexagon next to it. What that does is it puts box onto the canvas. Okay. We notice that there's a little orange bubble next to it, and that indicates insufficient data. It still could process things, but it's not necessarily an error. If there were an error, it would be red. So if I hover over this little thing, it tells me exactly what it's missing. It tells me what the component is. This object contains one warning. Click on the balloon to see all messages, and it says floating parameter box failed to collect data. Okay. The reason why I'm getting an insufficient data for this this component is that this falls under the geometry pattern. If I click on this little arrow here, this is all the kinds of geometry I can reference. Unless these components exist further down the script, the only way to get these to work is to reference something that already exists in your Rhino file. Okay? The way that I do that is I will right-click on this component. I will go to Set One Box, and then in Rhino, I'll just use the box that I have. And now the orange goes away. When I click on it, it highlights green. When I deselect, it's red. But now this component here in Grasshopper is linked to this cube here in Rhino. What I'm going to do to illustrate that difference even further is to delete the box that I have here, and the reference is still active, right? If I don't click on the component, it's red. If I do click on it, it's green.
So you kind of copied it into Grasshopper?
So sort of. What I'm doing is I'm referencing something that's already in Rhino and linking it to this script right here. Okay. You don't always have to do that, but if you have if you have something really, really complex, like if you had in Grasshopper, a B rep is a boundary representation. It basically just means a piece of geometry. So if you're working with something and you want to further script its creation or process or whatever, that would be the link between what you've already done and what you're going to do. Yeah.
Just so I don't get confused in the future or anything, when I click my box, it turns yellow instead of red. I don't know if I can change that or do you know how to change that?
I'm sure there's a way to change that, but that's not that big a deal. So when you click this thing right here, it turns yellow.
Yeah.
Okay. I think you changed that here. Yeah. This button right here, where it says Document Preview Settings.
Okay.
You can change these two. So normal would be the standard is normal is red and selected is green. You can have that any way you like.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. But let's say I want to start from scratch. Okay. I'm going to type in box again, and there are, let's say these two right here. There is center box and box 2 point. Okay. I'm going to bring them both into the canvas here. So I'm going to click center box, and that goes here. Again, I'll click box here, and I'll bring in box 2 point. If there's a certain component in Grasshopper that you don't want to see in Rhino, you can right-click and deselect Preview. And it'll go away. And see how the component turns a bit of a darker gray? You know that that one is visually hidden. If you want to see it again, right-click, Preview. If you don't want to see anything at all, click this green button right here where it says only draw preview geometry for selected objects. You'll only see a preview if you click on something. Okay? So let's start, I'm going to hide this one again. Let's start with this one right here. Okay?
Did you get something? I didn't see that.
If you double click to bring up the search bar, I typed in box again, but instead of doing the container for an existing box, I just brought in these two. There's center box and box 2. See those right there? What's nice about Grasshopper is if you hover over anything, it'll tell you what it wants or what it's going to give you. Okay. So right now, when I hover over the name of this component, it says create a box centered on a plane. So without going any further, what additional information am I going to need to continue to create this box? Sorry? Coordinate points, yes, but specifically on that definition right there, where it says, create a box centered on a plane. What do I need to give it? Plane. Okay. The default right here, if you hover over B, for this component, it stands for base. Not all B's and all components mean the same thing, so you kind of just need to get to know the components. This one right here says base plane. It says 1 locally defined value the XY plane. That's the default for this component. If you wanted this box to be centered around a different plane, some other surface, you would have to define that and feed that into this component. Okay? The way that we bring up default planes would be to double click and then just type the plane you're looking for. X, Y. That first one is a representation of the XY plane. XZ is a representation of the XZ plane. YZ, and so on and so on. Okay? But that doesn't give me much control, right? If we think of distilling the creation of our geometry as basic as we can, yeah, we can have the default of this box be centered in the center of the XY plane, which is 0, 0, 0, right, the world origin. That doesn't allow me to move the box around, right? And in proper workflows, instead of later down the road saying I want to move the box, it's better to say I want to move the plane, because then when I move the plane, the box will manifest at the center of wherever that plane is. Okay? So we're going to have to take a couple of steps back to give this box more control. Okay? So I'm going to delete this one right now. And we're going to define a plane. The default is already XY, but I'm going to bring in an XY plane container just for redundancy's sake, so you can see what's going on. And this right here, this is our representation of an XY plane. Okay? And the way that I link these components together is I hover over the output, which is the right side of the component. I click, hold down, and I drag. See that little arrow that comes out? I drag until it snaps to where I want it to go, and in this case, I want it to go into B. Okay? Nothing will change visually because the default plane for this box was XY, and I plugged in XY into XY. So nothing visually changed. Even if I were to change the plane, nothing would visually change except the orientation of the plane, because the center points would be the same, right? If I hover over B, the description text changed a bit. It said one value inherited from one source, world X, Y. So rather than it saying a locally defined value, which is the default, it now says it inherited a value. And what that means is it inherited the output of the previous component. Okay? If you're plugging one thing into the next thing, that's the text that it will give you. Okay? So now, if I can manipulate or transform this plane, that will then parametrically, by extension, move the cube. Okay? So we'll just set up a part of this script to move this box in the x-axis. Okay? So we need to take a step back so that we can move this plane. Okay? And you probably guessed that the command, or now the component to do that, move. Right? Type in move, there's move. Okay? If I hover over it, it says translate or move an object along a vector. Okay, so now, without hovering over anything else, what do I need to give this component for it to work? I need to give it two things.
So, like a place to move from and then a distance?
Which would be a vector. Okay. It would be position plus direction equals vector, right? And it says right here, translate or move an object along the vector. So I need to give it an object and a vector. Okay? So on the left here is the base geometry. That is what is being moved. So in this case, we actually need to put the move between the plane and the box. So what I'm going to do is right-click on B, and I'm going to disconnect the XY plane. When I hover over that, see how the little wire turns red? When I click that, it goes away. If you have multiple things plugged in, this will give us an error, but for example. If I wanted to say, oh, I want to disconnect the Y, I'll right-click, and it will show me what disconnects from the Y, versus if I right-click on, I guess it doesn't do that. Okay. Well, you right-click on the input that you want to disconnect, and it will disconnect that input. Okay. So, I'm going to plug the output of the XY into the input of move, and I'm going to plug it right into G. Okay? Now when I let go, instead of the geometry parameter being empty, it's now the XY plane. Okay? If I took this translated geometry, right now it's saying that the translation is 0. So the output of this hasn't changed anything. Okay. So since I know that I want this box to be centered around the plane, and I want to be able to move the plane, then the movement of the plane needs to be referenced into that base geometry. So that whatever I do to this plane, in this case it would be a move, it would then create the box over the moved plane. It doesn't make a huge difference when you're doing something very, very simple, but if you have something that's very complex, it's easier to move or translate or do whatever you're going to do to the most basic forms of geometry, and then allow the script to run its process based on that translated simple geometry. Right? It'll make scripts run better. I've written scripts that take several minutes to process, even when optimized. So this is sort of learning good scripting techniques. Right? Just like when you're in Rhino, you want to make sure you have separate layers, proper scale, proper units, proper layered colors. Same thing. It's just proper work. If I zoom out a little bit here, we will see that the box did move up 1 unit in the Z, because this, the default, 10 units, the default translation vector for move is 10 units in the Z. Okay? So from here to here, it moved this plane from, if I click here, that's the original plane, and then after move, it's right here. You see that?
Can you click it again?
Yeah, the original one is here on the bottom, right there, it's highlighted green. And then when I click on move, it's this one right here. Okay. Everyone okay so far? Yes. Try deleting the XY thing, and then bring it in.
G grid, G grid.
Okay, so the default translation vector for move was 10 units in the Z, but we said that we wanted to move this along the x-axis. And we don't necessarily want it to be exactly only 10 units, we want to be flexible in that, right? So we need to construct a vector that allows us to change its amplitude. Okay? So, we need to go back another step. You can work, and then again, me moving these things around, that's just a matter of preference. The cleaner this is, the easier it is to navigate. Next week, I'll show you some examples of scripts that I've worked on and things that you can do with it, and you'll see how much of a clusterfuck it can become. So, I want this vector to be x. So I will double click and I will type x. And that is a unit vector parallel to the world x axis. That's exactly what I want. I don't want to draw a line on the x axis because that would limit me based on, the starting point and the ending point. I want the x axis vector because that is infinite. Okay? And it's also a very basic form of geometry that doesn't have to go through a translation of a translation of a translation. Okay? So now, if I plug x into t, that will have moved the box 1 unit to the positive x, right? Because the output here is the locally defined value of 1, 0, 0, right? It's x, y, z. The one previously was 0, 0, 10. This one is 1, 0, 0. So that has changed the center point of this plane 1 unit in the positive x, or has displaced it positive 1x units. In terms of the units that Grasshopper calculates, it inherits the units from your Rhino file, right? Grasshopper is unitless, but will model and display things based on your Rhino file. So if it says 1, 0, 0, that's 1 inch, 0 inches, 0 inches, right? Because our units in our file will be inches. If you happen to change your file units to get Grasshopper to update and still function the same way, you have to save it, close it all out, and then reload. Yeah?
At what point, what did we do that made the z-axis go back down? Because before it was 10 and it was way up, and now it's
Yes.
back down.
So the default for move, if you don't plug anything into it, is 0, 0, 10. Okay? And without us doing anything, that's what moved that XY plane from 0, 0, 0 to 0, 0, 10. By plugging in the x-axis, that default value is 1, 0, 0. So by basically overriding that default move, that's what moved it 1 unit in the x rather than 10 units in the z. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
What made it go 1 unit in the x?
That's just the default value of the x vector output.
And so all of this manipulation that we're doing is to the center point of the box?
It is to the xy plane. That is the manipulation we're doing.
Okay.
And since the specific box component that we're using, it references the center of that.
Okay.
So if we can define the plane, we know that we'll get a box in the center of it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Are all moves always in the positive, or could they be in the negative?
they can be in the negative, and we're gonna change that right now. Okay. So, if we want to define how much in the x-axis this thing moves, we need to give it a numerical input. And there's a ton of different ways of doing that, and I'll show you a bunch. Okay? The first one I'm going to show you is what's called a hammer. This is my favorite component in Grasshopper. Not only does it allow you to input anything you want, but what it will show you is a written data output, and it's, I like using this for troubleshooting methods, right? If I plug the output of this box into here, it tells me more than I need to know about the data that's coming out of it. Okay? When you start doing more advanced things, this becomes really, really beneficial in organizing data trees, and I'll talk about that when we get into defining this grid. Okay? But so let's say it says double click to edit panel content. So if I double click, let's say I type in 5. Okay? The trick with this one is after you type something in, do not press enter. Click off of it. Okay? If I press enter, that means that this component thinks that I gave it one line of data 5 and the next line of data nothing. That doesn't work. Okay? So if I plug this 5 into the input of x, now instead of the xy plane being moved 1, which was this default, I typed in 5, and I can even hover over the output of that unit vector, and now it says 500 rather than 100. Does everybody see that? Is everyone being able to get that to work? Okay. So that's one way of giving Grasshopper some numerical inputs. Another way, you see this little panel right here, input? If you expand that, these are all of the kinds of inputs you can give a script. Okay? Some of these will work for what we're doing, some of them won't. For example, the Boolean toggle won't work. The empty slider won't work. A clock could work, because then you could have the movement of your cube be based on what time it is, and it would just move as time changes. But I'm going to show you the number slider, which is probably my second favorite component. It's super versatile, and it allows you to interface in real time with your script in terms of a numeric input. So there's actually 2 ways to get this. Is I can click on number slider here. That's what it looks like. Or I can double click, and I can type any number I want. 5,000. And see how as soon as I started typing, it changed to number slider? If I press enter, that gives me a number slider set on 5,000. Okay. But we're going to go in and edit this component. So any way you prefer bringing it up is fine, but we're going to change some of these parameters. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to double click on this portion of the number slider where it says slider. This window pops up. Everybody get that? And these are the parameters for how this number slider works. The number that I'll get out of it will be a real number. The minimum number I can select is 0, and the maximum number I can select is 1, with a sort of degree of 3 significant digits. Okay? So it would sort of make sense that the more I change and define those parameters, the more control I'm ultimately going to have over my cube. So let's say that instead of this minimum being 0, I'm going to double click, and I'm going to say that my minimum is -100. And I'll press enter. Okay? And now I want my max to be +100. And I'll press enter. instead of moving between 0 and 1, I can move between negative 100 and positive 100, which is a total right here, this range of 200 units. If I only wanted to move in increments of whole numbers, I would click on N. N gives us whole numbers, R gives us decimal numbers. If I want to be more fine-tuned with how I can move this, I can increase the number of decimal digits. Okay? But I'm just going to set this to N for now. Alright? So now when I click OK, that'll change the parameters. It'll sort of change how it looks, right? But I can zoom into this one component. And now it sort of makes sense. That little white diamond there, that's telling me the value that I have set to this number slider. And it makes sense that it's in the middle because we've defined the parameter between negative 100 and positive 100, right? 0 would be right in the middle of that. And if I just hover over this little diamond, see how those little arrows come up? I can just click and drag and set any number I want. I can also double click on the number and type in any number I want. Negative 15, 94, negative 23. But because I only have whole numbers enabled on this slider, if I type in 0.5, it's going to give me 1. I type in let's do 75.9683. That'll give me 76. Okay. If you want that decimal control, you have to go back here and enable it by clicking R. Okay. So I'm going to set this back to 0. And instead of this x vector being defined by one number, that, for example, if I clicked again and changed it to 6, that would move the cube again, one more unit. But that's sort of a lot of work to change it by, one unit at a time. I could instead take the output of this slider, plug it into the input of the vector. When it says 0 here, it's going to move it back to the origin. But as I move this slider left and right, that moves my box left and right. Alright, so everyone see that? Okay. And then if I want to kind of tell myself what this slider does, I can right click on it, in this little box right here, I can type in anything, and that'll change factor to whatever I type in. So we'll just say X movement. Okay? So now I know if I mess with this slider, that's what it's going to do in this script. Now, so this particular component technically doesn't exist in Rhino. That box geometry is only being previewed in Rhino. I can't go into Rhino and then select it and move it around or whatever I want to do. I have to do what's called baking. That's the process of getting geometry from Grasshopper into Rhino. Okay? And it's super easy. I'm just going to right click on the component that I want to bake. And I'm going to click bake. And this window will pop up. I can select what layer that I want to bake it on. And this is inheriting layers from Rhino. So if you have more layers, these will show up here. Color should always be by layer. And then if you're baking multiple things and you want them to be grouped, you can check this. But then the rest of these really don't change because there are other methods of doing more complex object and layer and material attributes in baking that we'll go over some other time. But if I just click OK, now this box actually exists in Rhino, right? If I move this slider away, that moves the preview away from what has been baked. I can select this and move it around. If I wanted another one, I can just click bake again. Put it on a different layer. Right? There's another box. I'll do it again on another layer. Yeah, there's another one.
I have a question.
Yes.
Are those planar surfaces,
Are what planar
the ones that
surfaces?
you baked into it?
They're
Do they have planes?
that's a good question. It says closed poly surface.
Those poly surfaces.
And that actually becomes really important when you do more advanced stuff. For example, if I wanted to do some transformation that required a closed solid, but I gave it a closed poly surface, I would get an error because the geometry isn't the same. This sort of goes into the nuances of the technical differences between a closed poly surface and a closed solid or any of those kinds of things. When you start constructing in a Grasshopper, you really see, I mean, geometrically, there's no difference between, you know, a cube poly surface and a cube solid. Geometrically, there's no difference, but in terms of data and what you have to control, there's a difference.
Is there a way to look like, is it always gonna just pop out of closed poly surface? I mean, a polygon, or can you specify what it bakes?
It depends on the component. So you now know that the center box component gives you a closed poly surface. Any questions so far? Well, what I can do now is, so this controls a box. But I already have a box that I've defined earlier, right? This one, I modeled it in Rhino, and I referenced it right here. So I could do the same translation to a different kind of geometry. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this and show you how you have to change it to get it to work. Highlighting works the same way as it always has in any modeling program. I'm going to press Control C and Control B. That gives me a copy. I'm going to drag this over. Okay. I'm going to take this component down here and do what I have to do with it. So now, I know that I don't need this box parameter because I've got this one here. So I'm going to delete that. And what I want to do is be able to move this box the same way that I move this box. So instead of this move component moving the X, Y plane in the X axis, I want it to move the box in the X, Y axis. So now when I click on this move component does the same thing. Does everyone see how I did that? I replaced the XY plane with this previously referenced box. And no matter what you plug in to this move component here, it will always work exactly the same.
Why did we plug in on the left side where last time we plugged in on the right side?
Well, so for this one, this only created a box based on a plane, right?
Okay.
We wanted to set this up so that we have control over the plane, knowing that later down the line, we'll get a box. This one, we already have a box.
Oh,
So instead of moving that XY plane in the x-axis, we're now moving this previously referenced box in the XY axis. Does that make sense?
So when we control the plane, the other one we're actually controlling the box.
Yes. So, and that kind of goes along anything. If I were to, for example, if I double click, let's say I type sphere. And I wanted to control this sphere. This one also asks for a base plane. So in any creation of geometry that requires a base plane, you want to manipulate the base plane knowing that the geometry will create itself wherever the center of that plane ends up. Does that make sense? Only in the cases where you are creating geometry in Grasshopper. Okay? If you already have geometry that you've modeled in Rhino, and you want to reference it into Grasshopper, you would do it this way, right here.
Why does my box component have like a thinner line going to my move one? It's different.
Sometimes it's just a visual thing.
I mean, everything's working fine, but it's just.
Right click on the right side of that. Go to wire display. Default. Okay. Right click on G.
Oh,
There you go. It's
Okay.
yeah, it's just a display thing.
okay.
Yeah. You have what?
red line connecting to the box with the G.
Box. Did you reference a geometry under box? That's what you got. You have to model it in Rhino. You have to right click on box and say set one box.
Oh,
Okay. You could also do that without modeling it in Rhino. If I went here and I just said set one box, if I wanted my box to be slightly different, I just do that. Yeah.
I have two. I'm moving it in one still.
Yeah, so in terms of the display that we see, I've hidden this box, but if I show it, there's my original box, and here's my moved box. So that's sort of the benefit of hiding certain things as you go, so that you can only see the most recent transformation or whatever. Okay. And then, just to finish off this box component, we could relate, this could be quite interesting, we could relate the movement of the center plane to the size of the box itself, right? Because we have X, Y, and Z components here that aren't being defined. This box right here. And again, the defaults for this would be the size of box in the X direction is 1, the Y is 1, and the Z is 1. Right? Those are the defaults. And you want, in terms of understanding this particular component, it's crucial to realize that since the box is created at the center of the plane, half of the dimension of the X is going to be in the positive direction, and half the dimension of the X is going to be in the negative direction, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, if I, for example, if I give this another number slider, let me just copy the one that I have. And let's say I plug that into the X right here. And what that'll do is that'll really just stretch this box in the X. Right? By 1 unit at a time, or I guess 2 units at a time. Okay. I could do the same thing with the Y. And that would just stretch this box